In this video, I will be teaching us and showing us how to produce deep color paints without roller marks, especially the likes of gray, laterite red, and some other deep color paint. In fact, it's not some other deep color paint, it is actually across board. Every deep color paint, if you apply the principle I'm going to teach you in this video, if you apply some of the things I will be showing you, like the additives that you need to use in your production when producing this type and this range of paint, you will no longer have issues with deep colors and you will no longer have issues with roller marks. So I want you to stay with me as I walk you through the process, the additives, in other words, the chemicals to use in your paint in order for you not to have roller marks, to eliminate it totally. This is not just going to be a one-time hit and run thing. It's going to be once you follow through the processes I will be showing you, you have consistent results. So I will actually be taking you through the journey. But then that's what a paint formulator and a paint producer. So you want to actually stick with me because I know exactly what I'm talking about, because I've been in this game for quite a while. I think 15 years now, counting. So I will actually be taking you through some of the factors to be considered and some of the pillars that ensure that you don't have roller mark problems. Just stay with me in this video. So have written some of the things that will actually try to walk you through on the board, so that we can actually effectively combat or take care of this roller mark problem issue. So I said I called it the factors to be considered. The very first factor I wrote here is the PVC CPV. So just work with me. In the end, I will be showing you the exact thing to do, the addictive to do, to add in that paint, and then you not have you have no roller mark issue. So just stay with me, be patient. I'll walk you through PVC and CPV. I've explained this times and over that PVC simply means the pigment volume concentration, or the pigment volume ratio. In other words, what that means is the ratio of your pigments, to the ratio of your binder. Now, why do we have to consider this issue when talking about deep color paint and when talking about roller marks and resolving it? Is because of this. Two things are actually very, very critical when it comes to deep color paint. The pigments to the binder ratio is always very high. Why? Because they are deep color paints. It means that the pigment load is always very, very high. So when producing deep color paint, you want to ensure that there is a balancing between the pigment load and the binder use, if you don't want the issues of roller mark. But if you don't pay critical attention to this very first factor, there's nothing you can actually do. You will end up with roller mark. So what that means is that when producing your deep color paint, you know that this base I'm actually producing, this paint base I'm actually producing. What I mean by paint base is the white mixing, the white emulsion that you have actually produced before tinting. It was what we call the paint base, in order for you to get the exact color you're actually looking for. That very particular paint is called the paint base. So the paint base, you have to pay critical attention to the paint base in how you actually arrange or add your chemicals in that very paint base, in order for you not to have a roller mark. So what you want to pay attention to there is the pigment load. So the first one, I have actually told you times without number that we have two different pigments in any production. In any production, you have two different pigments. At least one of it must actually be, one or two of it must actually be used in that paint product. We have the primary pigment, and we have the secondary pigment. Under the primary pigment, we have what we call the prime pigment, and then under the secondary, we have what is called the fillers or extenders. extenders. So you want to pay critical attention to what I just explained. So we have the prime pigment. In deep color paints, there's necessarily no need for a prime pigment. Why? Because the coloring pigment, we still have what we call the color pigment or the coloring pigment. Color pigment. So the color pigment that you're actually going to use will make up for your prime pigment. This prime pigment, example of prime pigment is titan. Is a prime pigment. So that means it's actually the primary pigment. It is what actually gives to the paint its opacity. So in deep color paint, sometimes we actually excuse this prime pigment titan and we focus on the color pigment. Why? Because we want to arrive at that particular color on time. We want to arrive at it much more quicker than if we apply this titan. So we arrive at the color much more quicker than if you had your titan. Now, when you now begin to add your color pigment, the color pigment will now begin to make up for the PVC, the CPVC, which is the critical pigment volume concentration ratio. This one means that you are actually heading towards a position that will overcome your binder. I will not, it's becoming a little bit technical. Let me just shift my attention to this and make it much more simpler. So what this means is that the ratio, the PVC means the ratio your binder must be enough. The ratio of your binder, of a binder, must be enough or equals to the ratio of your pigment. Now, either your color pigment or your filler or extender, whatever it is. So in other words, the binder you're actually using in that production must be effective enough to hold all the pigment in place. It must be effective enough to wrap around all the particles of the pigments you are using in order for you to hold it in place. I explained van der Waal force. Van der Waal force some time ago, that when you disperse a pigment, you are actually pulling them off from each other. You are spreading them in the medium, but they have this force that wants to bring them together to form an agglomerate. We call there's something we call agglomerate. In other words, you are bringing all the particles and molecules back together for you to form that colloid that it was, the form it was before. Now, because of you adding the dispersant into that production, you are able to scatter them. Now, what you use to hold them in place is your binder. It's your binder. And under that also, we have the primary binder and we have the secondary binder. The primary binder is your acrylic. That's the acrylic, which emulsify and hold the pigment in place. The secondary binder we have is your thickener. Just that's the layman term to call it thickener, but it is actually called rheology fire. These are the things that hold your pigments in place and ensure that they remain dispersed without having to come together. So if any of those things fail, that is when you will now be having paint that settles, paints that separates and all that. So you want to pay critical attention to your PVC. So it must not be over, or it must not get to the critical concentration volume when producing. In other words, you want to keep it in a range that allows the pigment to be able to to be the binder to be able to fill the spaces of the pigments. What that simply means is you should have SX binder in your production. Ensure that it goes beyond the normal standard you usually use. That's simple enough to understand. So what that means is if I'm using 1.5 kg, if I'm producing normal colors, when I'm producing deep colors, I should actually add an allowance that should make it maybe 1.8 or 2 kg. That's what it means. Why? Because you are having a load, a pigment load that is actually drawing towards your critical pigment concentration ratio. In other words, your pigment is trying to overcome, is getting to a level that it overcomes the binder, that has to hold it in place. So if you leave it at that stage, that is a sure indicator that you are going to have roller mark when you apply that paint. But if the pigment, no, the pigment is within the confine of your binder, you will not have that issue. So you want to pay attention to that, okay, if I'm using 1.5 for normal color, I want to use 2 kg so that I can provide, a ventilating room for the binder to operate and guide conveniently or hold conveniently the pigment. No, somehow I actually want to begin to follow the dictate of people don't stay long on videos and all that. No, it seems I will not really be concerned about that again. I'll just do my own teaching. If you like, you watch to the end. If you don't, no problem. So I'm actually going to teach the way it ought to be. I'm spending my time, I'm spending my effort, and it is for you to watch to the end for your own good. No, that's the little I can do. That is the little I can do. So that is actually dead about that you have that at the back of your mind. Another thing you want to pay attention to, which I have actually discussed together with this, is your binder. You have to ensure that the binder you're actually using is good enough for production. No, so let's move on quickly to the next thing that we need to talk about: the additive that is actually used in that production. What are the additives that is expected to be used when producing deep color paint for you not to have roller marks? So you want to pay critical attention to these additives that you are actually using. Your dispersant, you must have enough dispersant in your production. Enough dispersant. What dispersant does is to ensure two things: the surface tension of your medium, which is your paint, now is reduced for water to get into it. I usually say this times without number that water is a poor solvent. Water is a poor solvent. That means it cannot wet properly without an assistant. So we have an assistant in the place of the dispersant, which is what we most people knows it as is Calgon. But then Calgon is actually a polyphosphate salt, or sodium salt. No, sodium polyphosphate salt. Sodium polyphosphate salt, or phosphate salt. It's a phosphate salt. So what the chemical inside of it is sodium polyphosphate. But then I used to tell you there are other much more active dispersant other than this one that most of our vendors usually stock. We have ammonium polyacrylate. Ammonium polyacrylate is the most active dispersant that you can use. We have sodium polyacrylate also, but ammonium is very, very good. So another thing you want to pay a critical attention to is your surfactant. You want to add enough surfactant in your production in order to reduce the surface tension. I told you earlier that water is a poor solvent. It doesn't wet properly. It doesn't wet your pigment properly, and your water needs to wet all of your pigment properly for you not to have the issue of roller marks when you are actually rolling. So you want to pay critical attention to the surfactant you are using. You want to ensure that it is a very effective and active surfactant. No, surfactant. No, I'm just actually calling it surfactant. Most of us know it as Jeniper, but Jeniper is just a brand name. What is inside Jeniper is surfactant, which is sulfate acting agent. Sulfate acting agent. In other words, it reduces the surface tension of your paint for water to be able to get into the pigment and for proper wetting. So that is just basically what that does. You want to add enough of it in your production, So, but not overshooting it. Another critical one you want to talk about now, which is the most important after, in terms of, in the hierarchical order of this listing. It is absolutely very, very important. It's absolutely very, very important is humectant. Humectant. What are humectants? Humectants are, chemicals that ensure that, water is actually retained in your production. When paint is applied, every solvent in your paint evaporates. Your water, your texanol, your DOP, and every other thing. They are just temporary, or butyl glycol, ethylene glycol, propylene. All of those things are just temporary. Accompanying, they are temporarily accompanying your paints, so in order for you to be able to get it to the substrate. Once it is on the substrate, they eventually evaporate and leave the paint's surface. So in paint production, we call some of this addictive humectants. One example of humectant that you want to use is the propylene glycol. Propylene glycol. So what this does is that it opens a longer time. It gives your paint a whole longer time for it to dry. In other words, it slows down drying process. One of the reasons why you are going to have roller mark on your paint is because it dries faster. The one you put on the paint is drying before you bring another one. So once that one dries, there's going to be that one will give a lighter shade than the one you're actually bringing, and that is how that layering will now continue. But when you add stuff like propylene glycol, additives like propylene glycol, it ensures that the one you are actually bringing on the substrate, on the wall you are painting, remains wet, it keeps what we call wet edge. When you are now bringing another one, it just rhymes with it. So the flows continues like that. So you want to involve or ensure you involve stuff like this type of addictive in your deep color paints. These are top secrets that people will not want to expose to you or will not want to give to you, but I'm actually giving it to you for free as part of my community. So you want to pay attention to additives such as propylene glycol, ethylene glycol when you are actually producing deep color paint. You may not necessarily have to add it in every other color paint, but then in deep color paint, it is very, very critical to have them. But it is not bad to add it in every range of your paints. It is very, very excellent. It's good. It's nice. So you now use it in combination with a coalescent agent such as texanol. Use it with a coalescent agent, texanol, and then you can also bring some other words like ethylene glycol, butyl glycol alongside. But then you can just choose one of these, the combination of one of these, texanol in combination with propylene glycol, or in combination with ethylene glycol. So use texanol, propylene, and ethylene glycol. So you can actually use that combination in order to ensure that your paint is wet, keeps a wet edge for a longer time. So without wasting much of our time, we'll move on to the next one, which is the dispersion time. The dispersion time is actually the time you spend in grinding your paint. If you don't spend enough time in grinding your paint, you eventually end up with roller mark. Yeah, that is guaranteed. But when you spend quality time grinding your paint, you will not end up having a secondary grinding on the wall or on the substrate you're applying, because there's what we call the shear force, the low shear force. So the movements, the up and down movement of your roller is also grinding, which is actually a secondary grinding. So you want to avoid that completely by ensuring you grind properly. You grind properly, spend quality time grinding, don't rush your production. That is what it means. Don't say I'm trying to save time, I'm trying to save energy. Probably you are connected to lights, band A, band B, and all that. Yeah, I want to save energy and all that. Please ensure you have proper grinding before let down grind your pigment very well before let down. The let down process is actually the addition of your binder, the addition of your binder. So you want to pay quality attention to data as well. In order for not to make this video too long, I will not be explaining too much about that. So we want to talk about the next one, which is the paint viscosity. Very, 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 very important. The paint viscosity will determine whether there's going to be a roller mark or not, whether that paint is going to have roller mark or not. One of the major problems we face in this part of the world, or Nigeria, I'm speaking for Nigerian producer, is the fact that we don't know more than just one thickener in this part of the world, whereas there are lots and lots and lots and lots of other thickeners that ought to be used, or rheology fire. Let me be talking technical terms, because I'm not just speaking to Nigerian audience. There are loads and loads of rheology fires that we have. So in your paint, you actually want to use more than one type of rheology fire. The one we usually use the most here is the HEC or HPMC. Those are the one that is actually most common to us. Most common to us in this part of the world. But then there are other ones. You have the UER. I call it HOR, UER, which is a polyurethane thickener, a low shear polyurethane thickener. We have HAES and other ones like that, but I will not be talking too much on that in this video, in order for it to be short and precise and concise. So I will actually leave it at that. So probably in my next video I will now focus very, very much on this viscosity and rheology fire, and how it affects the quality of your paint. So if you follow through with all of these things that I've actually explained to you, if you follow through with all of the things I've explained, that you pay attention to your PVC, you pay attention to your binder, you pay attention to your additives, and most especially your propylene glycol, which opens, which give your paint enough time to dry, not drying faster than it hurts you. You will not have the issue of roller marks in your deep color paint. See you in my next video. Bye.